Okay, so good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone present here. Friends of Elephants, in collaboration with Gaja Conservation Trust, present today's talk on elephants in Anthropocene. For many of you who don't know what are Friends of Elephants, we are we are not an organization or not proposing to be one. We are an informal group of people with various expertise concerned about elephants and other wildlife. This group is a forum for disseminating knowledge linked to elephants and other wildlife science, conservation, and welfare through art, culture, literature, movies, talks, and discussion panels. We have been conducting these events as offline since April 2014 and online events from 2022. Our expectation is that people who have attended our events formally or informally participate or help in developing appropriate conservation and welfare measures for wildlife, including elephants. Now, the flow of event is that today we'll have a wonderful session on elephants in Anthropocene by Dr. Shermin, followed by a conversation between Dr. Meghna and Dr. Shermin on elephant ecosystems during their evolution and now. And finally, we'll conclude our session by Q&A session moderated by Dr. Shikhar Srivastava. I'm Riya Ghadyale, your host for tonight. I'm a geospatial researcher with a wide range of interests, including climate change, forest ecology, and wildlife. I hold a master's degree in geoinformatics from BIT Meshra, specialized in bamboo forest mapping. Currently, I'm working with Karnataka Forest Division to map elephant distribution areas across entire state. Now we move on to our first talk on elephants in the Anthropocene by Dr. Shermin. I welcome Dr. Shermin Silva. She is a professor in ecology and behavior and evolution at University of California, San Diego, which is a home for Human Nature's Lab. It's a US-based nonprofit organization focused on evolution and conservation of elephants and their habitats. Her research ranges from behavioral ecology to interactions mostly focused on large animals. She holds a Ph.D. from University of Pennsylvania and is subject in Sri Lanka, which she initiated in 2005. She is a member of Asian Elephants Group of IUCN Species Survival Commission. I welcome you, ma'am, and the stage is yours.
Hello, hi everyone. Can you hear me? And can you see me?
Yes, Dr. Sharma, we can clearly hear you and see you.
Okay, great. So let me just screen share. And let me first put up the slide. And while I share my screen. Elephants, as we all know, are part of a very diverse clade of proboscideans that existed before the Pleistocene for millions of years across all continents. But today are represented by just these three living species, the Asian elephant and the African savanna and forest elephants. Now, when I was a graduate student, I was mystified by something that I read that we've probably all heard, that Asian elephants, if you go by their teeth, Asian elephants are more adapted to a grazing diet than African elephants, based on these lamellae, which are the raised ridges on their molars. So African elephants have these diamond-shaped, lozenge-shaped, what they're called, lamellae, which they're named after, Loxodonta. And elephants have these very parallel ridges, and this supposedly is, for more of a grass-based diet. And if you observe them behaviorally, they actually seem to bear that out, where Loxodonta do a lot more browsing, and forest elephants are a lot more frugivorous than elephants, which Asian elephants tend to even though they are both generalists and they both have really varied diets, Asian elephants really do like grasses and monocots. And so why this difference has puzzled me, because Asian elephants we typically think of them as more forest living species than savanna elephants, as they're named, they live in savannas, which we think of as being grasslands. So why would they have these reverse diets? Now, going back for those of you who may or may not be familiar, right, the time span that separates Asian elephants and African elephants is about 6 million years. And for perspective on that, that's about comparable to the time span that separates humans and chimpanzees, as well as the big cats. So this isn't a minor, span of evolutionary time. It's pretty major. And the two lineages, even though they look similar and we kind of, treat them as being similar, they are not they have the potential to be as different as lions and tigers and leopards. And over this long evolutionary history, like I said, they weren't the only ones around. So all proboscideans originally evolved out of Africa and then spread throughout the continents. And as you know, there were elephants even in North America and Europe. And then their relatives, the Gomphatheria, were in South America. And over this period of time, they diversified. And how this happened was actually for a very long time in the evolutionary history, when they were restricted to Africa, they were pretty much like this hippo-like creatures, not very big, not very diverse. And then 20 million years ago, the African continent ran into the Eurasian plate. And that's what allowed them to sort of escape Africa, so to speak. And once they did that, they acquired these very diverse forms. And a couple of recent studies have shown, there's been this old debate of, why did this really diverse, very successful lineage go extinct? Was it climate change? Was it hunting? And, when we look at these different species, often with elephants, the tusks get all the attention when people think about poaching and ivory and everything. But to really understand elephants and their ways of life, you have to look at their molars. The molars tell you profound stories, because the molars are what do all the work. They are what the elephants used to eat. And so when you look at the molars, you can tell a lot about diet. And so on the left-hand side here, you see that that little small hippo-looking creature that was their early ancestor, and it had a more browse-adapted diet. And some of these, as you go along to the right, more recent, and on the far right, you have Paleoloxodon, was a graze-adapted species. So it was committed grazer. Now, if you look at this variation in the teeth, that's an evolutionary span of 60 million years being represented here. And lots of different dietary habits and choices. But if you look at Dinotherium, which is the second one from the left, which is really tall, right, you realize that it's pretty much a committed browser. It has to browse. Its neck doesn't, and its trunk potentially doesn't reach the ground. It's like a giraffe, right? So it pretty much has to browse. And this increasing browsing is indicated by increasing hypsodonty, which is the crown height. You can see the molars are getting taller, and that's because grass is really abrasive, and it's acquiring more and more lamellae, or those ridges. And so those are indications of them being graze adapted. So in this study, which was published in 2021 in Nature, Ecology, Evolution, authors reviewed a whole bunch of lineages and their dietary habits and when they went extinct. And at the height of proboscidean diversity, which was about 8 to 10 million years ago, if I recall, there were species that were sympatric. They were living, there were multiple elephant species living in a particular habitat. But they find that this decline started with climate change, and it started long before humans and our hunting pressure were really an effect. And obviously later on, as humans became more of a hunter and spread out throughout the continents, it had an effect. But the reduction in proboscidean diversity actually happened way before that. Now, why did that happen? And then there's another set of studies, by Adrian Lister. Some of you might know him. He's a member of the Asian He has this wonderful study others specifically, he looks at the change in the sort of the environment millions of years versus what is here, a soil attribute. And you can look at the carbon isotopes content in paleosalt to see whether they're primarily C3 or C4 plants. And you can see that around 20 million years ago, you have a signature that is more representative of forest, and that coincides with a lot of species being reliant on a browse type of diet. And then it starts shifting towards a more woodland mixture and then grassland type of dominated environment. And that shift happens between 8 to 5 million years ago. And that paleosalt, shift, you see those dots kind of tracking to the right. Now, if you look at so that's what's happening in the environment. And then if you look at what the animals were eating, and based on the tooth enamel, that's the middle panel, and the different shapes or different species of proboscideans and relatives, you see that they also start tracking to the right. But then there's this middle part where, if you look at the far panel, which is the Hypsodonte index, and that tells you morphologically whether the teeth were adapted for a browse-based diet, you see that there's this discrepancy between the middle panel and the far right panel, where the middle panel, they start eating stuff, and then it goes into their tooth enamel, and so you can see the isotopic signature of their diet in the tooth enamel, right? They're eating more of a grass-based diet. But the Hypsodonte index is showing that it's still pretty much a browser-like tooth. Like these are browsing, the teeth are adapted for browsing. And there's a lag. In fact, there's this middle zone, which is between those two green lines, which is a 5 million year, 3 to 5 million lag between this dietary shift, which is a behavioral shift to eating grass, and the adaptation of the dentition to eat grass. And if you think about elephants, right, they are a slow breeding species. It makes sense that it would take a long time for them to change aspects of their morphology, like their teeth, because the generation time is slow. The slower generation time, the slower species, the longer it takes to evolve, to adapt. So really, many animal species, not just elephants, are capable of making, Lister argues, they're capable of making these behavioral changes before the morphological evolutionary change, and behavior can precede adaptation. So now, if we come back to Asia, around 2.6 million years ago, we have what's possibly the ancestor of the living elephants, this species called Elephas hyesudricus, which is making its way from the Middle East to the Indian subcontinent. And then, because elephants came out of Africa, right, there has to be a west to east spread, and it would have had to go this way, just because that's where elephants evolved. And so elephants would have had to, so keep that in mind. So elephants are going from west to east, and as you go from west to east, as we know, like the Asian elephants of India and Sri Lanka were at one point connected via this land bridge. And the Sunda shelf, which was exposed until about 400,000 years ago, allowed these different parts of Southeast Asia to be connected. So this isolation is the most recent thing that happened about 400,000 years ago. And as you can imagine, whatever environments existed at that time, that's what elephants were exposed to, and their dietary habits, it hasn't been that long, 2.6 million years before elephants ever even existed and evolved, right? They evolved sometime within the last 2.6 million years. That's a relatively short span of time. And what you notice is, if you just look at the natural color image of this, and of course climates change over this time period, we've had the Pleistocene, and now 10,000 years ago it was an ice age, and then the ice retreated. And what we have consequently is this gradient, where on the upper, on the western side, more on the Indian subcontinent, we have a drier seasonal environment. And as you get towards Southeast Asia, you have a wetter and aseasonal environment. Now, that's not to say that that's how it always was. In fact, Sumatra actually had grasslands in it, and it had, little dwarf elephants living on it. And so, what you see today isn't necessarily what was always there. That's worth reminding. But the main point is that if you now look at the distribution of elephants and think about their history and their dietary choices, yes, today elephants have an extremely broad ecological niche, but they prefer to eat grass, and they do really well in places in India and Sri Lanka. We see large groups, right? Like we see large herds in savanna-like environments where they eat grass. And in the forest of Southeast Asia, we don't see such huge groups. We don't see really, super dense, super large populations of elephants. They're relatively small, cryptic, and even if the forests were intact and not fragmented like they are today, they seem to be in these kind of small groups at lower densities. And all population surveys so far, kind of indicate that. Now, of course, we don't know how it would have been prior to the whole, hunting in the colonial era that pretty much eradicated a lot of elephants from a lot of environments and habitats. So we don't really know what their social behavior and aggregating behavior would have been like, but that's what we see today. So here we go back to my initial puzzle. How does a grass-loving species thrive in a forest, right? Asian elephants are, I think we might as well have called them Asian savanna elephants. Asian elephants, I'm going to argue, are basically a grassland, woodland, savanna adapted generalist species that lives in a forest today. And that's their lineage. They came from a savanna adapted lineage. So when you ask the question, well, how does this graze adapted species thrive in a forest? We have to ask, first of all, well, what do we mean by forest, right? This is a picture from Sri Lanka, and I'm sure you have very similar environments in India, where if you just look at this picture, I mean, is it a forest? Is it a woodland? Is it a grassland? It's a savanna. It's a little snapshot of a little savanna. But if you go to Borneo, it looks like this. And this is not as dense as some of the rainforests that these elephants are in. This still has some sunlight and open, and it's along the edge of a river, and the elephants really love this. But you can see grass in the understory. So what do we mean by forest? Is this a forest? Is that a forest? And is it sufficient to look at the environments where elephants live today to answer this question? So we looked at the history of these landscapes, and I'm just going to call them elephant ecosystems for now. And in 2023, we published a study looking at the change in suitable habitat between 1700 and 2015. And you can see from this map, the suitable habitats are areas that are yellow, and unsuitable habitats are areas in blue. And we went all the way back to the 800s, but the punchline is that the major changes happened between, the late 1600s, early 1700s, and 2015. And you can see the circles are around the hotspots of suitable habitat that disappear between 1700 and 2015. There's an obvious glowing hotspot in central Thailand. There's a glowing hotspot in northern Sri Lanka, and then there's a glowing hotspot in India. Now, from that central part of Thailand, the elephants are pretty much gone. And if you look at their present day ranges, they're kind of around the periphery of that hollow area. And in Sri Lanka, we still have elephants all over. In India, we still have elephants all over. That doesn't mean, though, that the habitat is still there. The elephants are there, but the habitat isn't. And here you can see it more clearly, where we've just binarized it, and we have suitable habitat in yellow and unsuitable habitat in blue. And I'm sorry that it's kind of small on my screen right now, so you can't really see very well, but the IUCN present day range is in that lower right corner. And you can see how that fragmented range, right, because elephants are one species, they would have had to be connected. They had to be one large interconnected population at one point. They wouldn't have been as fragmented as what we're seeing today. So in our study, we showed that there was 64% loss of suitable habitat since the 1700s, and out of that remaining range, that IUCN range in orange, less than 50% of that range is classified as suitable. Whereas in the 1700s, if we drew a buffer of 100 kilometers around the existing range today, everything inside that range and everything within 100 kilometers of that existing range was classified as suitable. All right, so elephant habitat has been lost in just the last 3 centuries, and that fragmentation pattern, that's not an old, pre-Pleistocene pattern. That's a very recent 300 years ago kind of pattern. So what is an elephant ecosystem? What kind of ecosystems were they exactly, and what are they now? So some of you might be familiar with, or if you're not, I encourage you to look at this very interesting work by Earl Ellis and colleagues in his group, showing that humans have had an impact on landscapes for a very long time. And humans have been occupying various different landscapes and managing them in different ways. And according to this model, a set of models going all the way back thousands of years, to 72% of terrestrial ecosystems had already been inhabited by people by the end of the Ice Age. And this includes 95% of temperate and over 90% of tropical woodlands. So over 90% of tropical woodlands had people in them, and wherever people go, we weren't just sitting there, right? We were doing things, and we were having an impact on the landscape in various ways, not just like indigenous cultures, that might be the first thing that we think about, but also, shifting agriculture, farming civilizations. In Asia had plenty of farming civilizations that, that disappeared in the meantime, that came and went. And so humans have been doing various things in this environment. So here again, we have this map that I showed you earlier, where you have the yellow suitable habitat and blue unsuitable habitat. And now I'm going to show you, I'm going to superimpose, this is unpublished work that we are now currently working on. We looked at, okay, what types of anthropogenic influence was there on these habitats? And for that, we used this Anthrone dataset that the Ellis group has made publicly available. And so we just basically overlaid the suitable habitat in these 2 time periods with those Anthrone classifications. And here's what we get. So the suitable habitat in 1700 is everything that's in color. And the areas that are in white are the areas that were already classified as being unsuitable in 1700. And those green shades, those are predominantly populated woodlands, and that's in that central Thailand hotspot. And then in India, that big green area, that's residential woodlands interspersed with inhabited drylands. And then likewise in Borneo, we have kind of these green shades, these are woodlands. And really in southern Borneo, that's the only place where we really see remote woodlands. That doesn't mean that there's no people in there, but they're a wilder class of woodlands than the populated and residential woodlands. But across Sumatra, again, we have populated woodlands. And then what do we have in 2015? So in 2015, first of all, those gray areas, that's all the area that converted to being unsuitable in that time. So area that was previously suitable in 1700, but became unsuitable. And whatever is left, that's what you see in color. So you can just by eye, you can pretty much see a color match between the areas that are left and the areas that were suitable in 1700. The colors are very similar, except for this weird exception of Sri Lanka, where it looks like we have villages and rain-fed villages, which are classified as being suitable habitat. But of course, you might know that elephants pretty much were eradicated from Sri Lanka in that time. So Sri Lanka, if elephants were there, it would be excellent habitat for them, but they're not. That's what it's telling you. And so that's the areas of suitable habitat. And what about those areas in gray? What did they convert into? They converted into villages, into rain-fed villages, irrigated villages, rice villages. So all those purple shades are different kinds of villages. And then you can't see very well in this map, but the pink areas now have masked out the suitable habitat that's left in 2015. So everything else, you can see the mismatch in color. So that's the change that happened. So the change that happened wasn't that humans went and started cutting down pristine wilderness or changing the forest, occupying forest that was previously unoccupied. No, the change that happened was the intensification of what we've been doing, like humans settling down pretty much into settled permanent agricultural villages, sometimes with irrigation. That's the change that happened. So coming back to this question of savannas and woodlands, human activity doesn't explain the origins of savannas and woodlands in Asia, but they might have been really important in maintaining them in a certain state. And there's a number of people who have advocated for the importance of savannas in Asia and the role that they play, the unique ecology of savanna ecosystems. So woodlands and / grasslands are naturally occurring biomes in parts of Asia. And whether or not they're purely anthropogenic is kind of beside the point. The point is that they occur. There are species that are adapted to those environments, and human activity like fire, shifting agriculture, they enhance these grassy areas. They create this kind of complex mosaics, even in the middle of forests, like you have in East Asia. And the transition to more permanent settlement and cropping is what drives the habitat loss. And the changes in management alter the remnant forests. So we have a paradigm now today, post-colonialism, where you have, for example, protected areas where the policy is much more hands-off, and so this kind of activity is not allowed in protected areas. So that also changes the dynamic. So just leaving an area and letting it kind of be whatever it is, essentially a tree museum, I would call it. That's not the environment that historically occurred, and that's not the environment that these species are adapted for. So humans, we construct niches. Niche construction by humans also supports other species, whether we want it or not, and inadvertently it supports other species. So how do we do this? We manage water. We create water sources. These are 3 different reservoirs in Sri Lanka. So this is a village reservoir that's a small scale reservoir that is now completely inside Udawalawe National Park. It was created in the 1970s and 80s, and you can see the diversity of birds and other wildlife that are now making use of that little tank. It was a village tank that was then evacuated when the protected area was created. And then the large dam reservoir, which was created in the 1960s and 70s, the reservoir after which Udawalawe National Park is named, which is also a resource for wildlife now that it's protected inside a protected area. And then we have this ancient reservoir, which was built in the 3rd century BC on the far right. And that's a reservoir that is purely rain-fed. There's no big dam or river that it's sitting in. And this reservoir, if it was created in the 3rd century, you can imagine, there would have been villages and agriculture and things around it, but now it's in a protected area. So, that's water, and then of course fire. So this is human. These are grasslands in Wayanad district in Kerala in India, and according to my postdoc who has worked with indigenous Katanakan communities, this is what they call quote unquote good forest. And good forest is forest that is has good visibility, has a kind of a semi-open canopy. There may be trees in shade, but there's also this nice grassy understory. And they historically managed it with fire. And they had a very principled way of applying fire. They didn't just burn things willy-nilly. And they managed it to have a certain appearance, to allow them to move freely, allow them to hunt freely. And it also would have benefited large herbivores and large, and grazers like not just elephant, but also cattle and, banteng, and obviously there's in gaur in India and banteng in Southeast Asia. So these are things that people did. So now if we go back to the living species, long history, and we ask, why did, people want to know, why did the proboscideans go extinct? I think we have an answer to that question, which it was mostly driven by climate change, and in fact might have to do with over-specialization in the face of climate change. The species that went extinct when they were sympatric, there's another study that shows, when you had like 3 species that were living in sympatry, the ones that were pretty much obligate browsers and were more committed to a browsing diet versus Elephas, which was already quite more, had a dietary generalist, was a dietary generalist at that point. Elephas survived and the others went extinct. So it's not a very large set of observations. It's a sample of one observation, but it is tempting to think that this, if you're a large, slow breeding species, you kind of have to be a generalist, because if you over specialize and then the conditions change, you're in a bad situation. But even though they specialize, right, it's equally interesting to ask, well, given that these other species did go extinct, why did these survive? Why did these 3 species survive? And I think that's an equally interesting and perhaps really relevant question today in the face of not just climate change and anthropogenic disturbance, but also human-wildlife conflict, right? As our human population increasingly imposes on habitats for our wildlife. And I think the answer to that is that these species survive because they are actually very young species. Elephas maximus is a relatively young species, and the 2 African elephant species, they all co-evolved with humans. Humans as hunters, yes, but also humans as ecosystem engineers and modifiers, which the elephants took advantage of. Even with forest elephants, there are indications that forest elephant populations are found in places where human villages have been, inside forest. And so elephants and humans have always been in close proximity, and elephants have maybe historically even benefited from human activity. This is an excerpt from Roberts et al. Perhaps most significantly for us here, however, is the fact that humans have now been found not to be only present in tropical forests over deep time, but also were in some cases modifying them. In the context of the late Pleistocene, hunter-gatherers may have played a role in the extinction of many genera and species of megafauna during the late Pleistocene Holocene, resulting in cascading loss of biodiversity, which phenotypic analysis suggested represented 2 billion years of evolution. Now, this quote is representative of this perspective that is like, this kind of paradoxical relationship between human presence and sort of beneficial action, but also this implication that hunter-gatherers may have played a role in extinction. So we're always playing these 2 roles. But I just want you to bear in mind that in the common sort of in our thinking about ourselves as a species, it's common to emphasize that second role, that destructive role that we have played. And really, like, what we need to do is to embrace and remember our positive role in ecosystems and step into that role again. Because if we constantly are thinking of ourselves in this destructive way, and that we are really incapable of doing, living with nature in a positive way that we flourish along with nature, I think it's a failure of imagination that prevents us from solving our problems. So this again is a reflection of that negative thing, sort of painting this negative picture of what humans have done. And so this negative role that humans have had on wildlife, when we come to the present, right, that's what's front and center. That's what we see today, is we have this very destructive effect on ecosystems and wildlife, and even the wildlife that remains, even when we have good intentions. Those good intentions are sometimes not the right thing to do. So the second part of it is, of the elephant in the Anthropocene, is now we have elephants that are living in close proximity with people. And we, for better or for worse, elephants and humans are interacting in other ways. And this is Rambo, who's a bull, and he's standing at the edge of an electric fence at Udawalawe National Park. And we have Don't Feed the Elephant. We have people over time having fed Rambo all kinds of fruits and vegetables and sweet things. And for context, here's Udawalawe again. This is the national park. You can see the outlines in the satellite imagery, and you can see that it's on the edge of Elephant Range in Sri Lanka, down in the south. And for a very long time, Sri Lanka is leading in human-elephant conflict around the world. Last year, we lost more than 400 elephants and more than 100 people because of interactions, these negative interactions. And that's kind of in contrast to this picture you see here from more than 13 years ago, where Rambo is standing behind this fence peacefully with a group of people standing in front of him. And this fence is barely visible in the photograph. It's just a couple of thin electric wires, and people passing by would feed Rambo. And despite signage, despite this official prohibition, but there's not really enforced. And this consequently is obviously, it encourages bad behavior on the part of the elephant and bad behavior on the part of people. And now Rambo is known to break electric fences after many, many years of not doing that for various reasons. But there was a prominent study a few years ago that claimed, that this type of feeding is not really detrimental. It provides supplemental nutrition. The strategy is only temporary for males, and provides some modest economic benefits for people, and encourages, positive, quote unquote, positive human-wildlife interaction. This was published by Putu Fernando and colleagues, which was shocking and surprising. And so we have observations of elephants over this same period in the same area, as well as observations from India that show that this behavior is obviously not harmless, and elephants can not only get killed just by being attracted to this edge and then breaking the fence and doing things on the other side that they're not supposed to. They get hit by cars, they get shot, and all kinds of things. And then they also get fed things that they shouldn't. Here's like a plastic bag in their dung. They also, are prone to becoming diabetic because of all the sweets that they're fed. And this is a great opportunity for disease transmission. So we definitely shouldn't be doing it. And this is not a temporary strategy. So here's the number of years that elephants have been observed at the fence. And a lot of them are seen in just 1 year, but there are some that are seen across 12, 13 years. So they keep coming back again and again. And in India, here we have in the Sigur Nature Reserve, Priya Davidar and Jean-Philippe Parvot have observed the same, elephants being fed by tourists, and 11 of the elephants were habitually fed by tourists prior to COVID. And then during COVID, people stopped feeding these elephants. One of them is Rivaldo here in this picture. And they were able to go back to pretty much their natural diet. Rivaldo in particular was a special case because he was injured and taken into for treatment, and he was fed during that time, so he was habituated. And then he was taken into captivity again a second time because somebody campaigned. He injured his trunk, and somebody campaigned to have him put into captivity permanently, and that didn't work, so they released him again. So he was habituated at various times. But since he's been released, he seems to have pretty much gone back to a natural diet. And 4 out of those 11 elephants had died by 2021 through documented or suspected human action. Rivaldo's still around, and the others are still around. And as far as we know, they don't forage in villages, and they're all right for now. So this is just a table of what happened to those other elephants. This is showing Rivaldo when he was being treated during that point. This is him after release. He still today is pretty much routinely followed and surrounded by forest guards so that people don't get close, because he's so habituated, and they don't want people to start feeding him again. So one of the challenges with studies like, or with cases like this, is that it's very difficult to publish these kinds of observations, because as scientific journals want systematic studies and hypotheses, and so don't tend to want to publish case studies based on 1 or 2 or a handful of individuals. So from a practical perspective, and we're talking about management, studies that purport to have systematic approaches and do some kind of simple statistics that are favored over studies that are observation based, and you can't do simple statistics because they're case studies of 1 or 2 individuals. Our decisions and our perspectives are biased in terms of what we can publish, and what we're allowed to talk about. But I think these kinds of stories are also really important to talk about and to learn from, because you would never set out to observe something for 12, 13, 20 years. This is all opportunistic. So there's no systematic study that can ever be done that would tell you what happens to these animals. But it's obviously very important to understand what those the consequences can be. And here's just a way of visualizing problem behaviors and how our actions can either how we might want to respond to problem behavior, and it's analogous to a biological invasion. So you have, just like you have an invasive species that might kind of initially be in small numbers, and then you have to try to control it before it goes out of control. You have a behavior that is initially maybe just exhibited by a small number of individuals, and it has to be, you might have a critical window as a manager to be able to control that behavior from spreading, and you really should crack down on that kind of behavior before it spreads in the population and can lead to potentially more conflict or negative impacts on species, on wildlife populations. So those are that's one of the many challenges of the Anthropocene today. Yes, we were beneficial, but to wildlife in the past, and when we think about habitat, what suitable habitat looks like, and restoration of habitat, we might want to keep that in mind, because it's not just a matter of having trees or grass. It's a matter of understanding what maintains that trees and grass. And then on the flip side, what we think is beneficial sometimes is not. Like, this well-intentioned people feed elephants for whatever reason, mostly to get pictures and selfies and things of themselves doing that. But conservationists who think that it might be beneficial, but that's not necessarily so. And with that, thank you.
That was a really wonderful session by Dr. Shermin. Thank you, ma'am, for encouraging us and giving us an awareness about the elephants in Anthropocene. So now, we move on to the next part of our session. That's an informal conversation between Dr. Meghna and Dr. Shermin on elephant ecosystems during their evolution and now.
Thanks, Riya. So
I welcome. I welcome Dr. Meghna Agarwala. She is an ecologist working on forest dynamics and their interaction with human-wildlife conflict. She completed her Ph.D. at Columbia University. Following this, she worked at Earth Institute in partnership with CRFOR Indonesia. Since then, she has been working as an assistant professor at Ashoka University. She is currently working on human-elephant conflict across India. I welcome you, ma'am.
Thanks, Riya. So, Shermin, that was a great talk. I'll just introduce myself. I'm mainly a forest ecologist, and the question that I'm interested in is how changing forest composition may be influencing human-wildlife conflict. So, Shermin, one thing that struck me in your talk was that when you showed in the 1700, when you showed where the elephants could be, all of those open woodlands or human habitat landscapes, they were all areas that. So basically what happens with savanna is there's two ways of having grasslands. One is if your precipitation is too low, in which case you could have grasslands. And the second is your precipitation is above a certain threshold, but it's only disturbance that's maintaining the savanna. And what was striking about your map was that all the areas where the precipitation is too low, those areas were never suitable elephant habitat, and all the suitable elephant habitat were those areas where the precipitation is above the threshold and it's disturbance maintaining the savanna in all of those regions. So it really does seem in this case that perhaps disturbance, whether in the form of fire or in the form of herbivory, was what created the landscape that was appropriate for elephants in the 1700s.
Yeah, so this question of what created the landscape versus what maintains it, and I think from the studies that that were in my slide, right? Like the argument is that the creation of the savannas predates humans, and so whatever those climatic conditions were, whatever the right, whatever it was, the antecedent conditions, the savannas originated prior to the major activity by humans. And now I don't know actually the human history on the continent that well. So I think this would call for also understanding from an anthropological perspective, right? What is the human presence and human, settlements and all of that. And then again, from the paleontological perspective, what were the suites of species that were there? But just from a very high level, perspective, we can just see, like, I mean, when I was in East Africa and I was just looking at the different suites of the guilds of species that you find, right? Like you have the elephants and you have the ostriches and you have whatnot. There are lots of species that are unique to Africa. But if I look at, there's crossover. So there's Indian rollers and then there's South African rollers, right? And then you have other species where you see there are these kind of sister species. Of course, we have the lions, which are now not that widespread, but once upon a time they were, right? And we have the rhinoceros. So you have these species that are more grassland/woodland adapted, savanna woodland type adapted species. And so, and on the Indian subcontinent side, which includes also Sri Lanka, and on the African side. So if you look at not just the plants, right? We're thinking about the plants and we're thinking too much about the plants. If you look at also the rest of the complete community, it's a mirror image, right? Africa, Asia, you have African savannas and Asian savannas, and the whole thing is one picture, right? And we have to take all of that together. And I'm tempted to see, like, I'm wondering if anyone has really done that. If you were to create an entire, list, and then if we go back in time historically, we know there were hippopotamus, right? And you told me this, Meghna, and and other species. So that really is the complete picture. I think when we look at just one thing, we tend to, maybe it's a little bit too narrow. And we look at just, grass or just fire or just a particular, woodland type. Though we look at the whole, it's really hard to escape the conclusion that these were just, mirror images of, their related sister taxa that then, diversified and branched off in other directions.
Yeah. And just to add to that, even in the forest elephants that we see in India, not in Southeast Asia as much, but like, when we think of Western Ghats, we think of it as evergreen. But all the elephants are also ranging on the leeward side of the Western Ghats, which is again dry deciduous woodlands. So there's still, it's very much like, I can't think of any elephant whose any elephant range whose habitat is not including the woodland habitat.
Right. And even woodland habitat that is more relatively recently modified, like thorn scrub, right? And that might, in some places that might be originally what it was, but in other cases it is a degraded habitat, because, like, for example, in southern Sri Lanka, we have introduced acacia trees, and these were part of a government quote-unquote forestation, forest scheme, afforestation scheme, after the deciduous forests that was there were cut down, and so if you look out now, it looks like, this acacia, it looks like parts of Kenya, like there's, elephants, and then there's grass underneath, and there's acacia thorn. But the elephants are fine there. Like they love this environment. They do fine in it. And, which is not to say that that's better or worse, but just that, what do elephants need? Well, they can do well in lots of different types of environments. So that's one of them. And the original deciduous forest, that's what they had before. And those deciduous forests would have had grasses, because people were doing shifting agriculture, and it was also a seasonal environment and seasonally very dry environment. What we still see in Sri Lanka is that the elephants also they don't really occur in a forest that is now protected and is completely undisturbed and has, and has big trees and, more of a closed canopy. They just don't occur there as much.
Yeah.
So
even Shikhar is going to come later, but he's also finding something similar. So when the canopy is too closed and there's no sunlight filtering in, that becomes really difficult for large mega herbivores like elephants to be able to stay there.
Right. And we have to keep in mind that it's, we are talking about elephants, but there's a lot of other species, right? Like whether it's the cattle, whether it's, deer and and there are these other things that we are maybe not focused on as much because they're not as conflict prone as elephants. And so this becomes really relevant, because if we don't have the right kind of habitat for elephants and they're forced to go outside of that habitat, which they will because they anyway have to disperse, right? Well, then you're setting up the stage for increased contact with people and with potential conflicts and with going into agriculture and all of that. So it's really important that whatever area that we've designated for elephants actually be appropriate for elephants, right?
So the second thing I thought was really interesting was when you were talking about those conflict animals that were being fed by humans, how when they were no longer given food, they returned to just using the forest. So do you think you could tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so in the case of the
Because I guess there's this idea out there that many people are testing that perhaps elephants are coming out to agricultural fields because it's more attractive because of nutrient levels rather than being pushed out because there isn't enough nutrition in the forest. So so the fact that they were able to go back says something about the elephants. So that's why I was wondering about your thoughts on this.
Oh, great question. Yeah, so I see. Yeah, so I mean, this is so this area I have not personally been. So that story is from, like I said, JP and Priya in the Sigur Nature Reserve, which is on the nestled in kind of the Nilgiri Biosphere Reserve. And it seems like there, at least, I mean, from what I understand, that is a very complex mosaic kind of landscape where you do have a lot of agriculture, you have people and whatnot. But when the COVID shutdown happened, it paused tourism, and these are very specifically elephants that were fed by tourists, right? And so whether or not they did any crop raiding, we don't know that. So it's just specifically with respect to being fed by tourists, and then being in the village and things. It seems like that has stopped, and since the pandemic happened and they kind of had to go back to foraging, and now the pandemic is over, and I think authorities are still really trying to enforce that. So they shared with me an article from a newspaper recently that some tourist lodge had, some people had been caught trying to again feed elephants and had actually been arrested, and so very severe punishment for doing this. So that indicates that, yes, they're capable of going back, and at least in that area, there must be natural forage. But whether they do other things like go into croplands, that we don't know, right? Yeah.
So I heard the WWF had radio collared some 5 elephants there that had been conflict elephants. So basically, they had been caught, and because they were conflict, they were raiding a lot. And after they were collared, when they were released from the collaring data, it seems that they stuck to the forest. So again, over there also you're seeing an example of them just sticking to the forest. Maybe it was unfamiliar, or I don't know why, but be interesting to look at.
Yeah. Well, and there's also, these other studies that some of them are, these genetic studies again that show that despite the fact that elephants can disperse over long distances, they don't necessarily. And Priya and JP are also observing that there are males, you would expect them to disperse, but there are males that are still sticking around their family groups. I mean, that's, to me, bizarre, like really unheard of with elephants in particular. But I don't know how much that has to do with fragmentation and how much that has to do with other things.
So one more thing I had is, given that you gave us such a hopeful view of the future about human-elephant interactions, given how the environment has changed, where do you see elephant-human interactions going in the future?
Thank you. So this is why my lab has kind of like done this pivot to a certain extent, where we're now no longer just focused on elephants, and we are also equally, I would say 50-50 focused on humans and what people do, because it is impossible to turn the clock back, right? So we can never go back in time. So we always have to go forwards. And the lesson here is that it's not that we're trying to reset these ecosystems into some state in the past, and we can't, because human population density is a lot higher, villages are there, like that's what's there. But at the same time, I think it's really important, to paraphrase Maya Angelou, I always say, like, you can't understand where you're going if you don't understand where you've been. And so in managing these ecosystems, there is oftentimes in many places a very colonial mindset with which those areas were created and managed, and a lot of social and justice issues that around those areas. And going forward, I think recognizing that the human species is not just purely an evil, destructive force, but that we can be a beneficial force. So, who are those? What can we learn from our history, and what can we learn about what an actual healthy ecosystem looks like from people who may have a very strong and close shared relationship with those ecosystems? I think is important. Indigenous communities especially, which I think in South Asian cultures have not been provided much many rights, and their perspectives have been devalued a lot, and not much very different from the West, and where Indigenous perspectives are now kind of coming up and more honored. And just recognizing that, well, okay, I think first thing is to really understand what the history was and what we learned from it, and then make policy decisions based on that understanding, then just kind of, sticking with this playbook that's 300 years old from the colonial era, and in terms of what forests represent, what wildlife should or shouldn't do, and where they belong, and where people belong. That's going to, and it's not going to be easy, that's going to raise some very difficult questions. And the most difficult question is, it is still the case that if we didn't have protected areas, right? I'm not saying we should get rid of them, because if we didn't have protected areas, all those areas that were purple, like it would be completely purple, right? Like we wouldn't have these remnant habitats at all. And so the difficult question is, these habitats are fragmented. I think the future means trying to link up those habitats, and really carefully thinking about what human activity is appropriate along those around those habitats, both for the sake of elephants, but also for the sake of people, because we can't have 400 people in India getting killed by elephants, right? That's just not acceptable. So it's from a humanistic standpoint as well as from a wildlife standpoint.
A difficult follow-up question, Shermin, is that people in various parts are their aspirations have changed, and they're choosing that they don't want to coexist with elephants. Like in many areas, like they're lobbying governments against elephants, etc., etc. So how do we resolve that? Because that's sort of a problem.
Yeah, well, I think that is going to take a lot of just action and activism and working with people on the ground, right? Like that's where, we different people have different roles to play. So I, from the 60,000 foot view, like can't influence that dynamic and can't talk to people on the ground, but organizations that are based in those locations can hopefully take the kinds of work that we're doing and these perspectives and translate them into into dialogue, into policy, into educational material, into whatever has to happen on the ground. And when I say education, I really don't like this kind of passive education where you just say, oh, we're going to do an awareness campaign, we're going to do like raising awareness. Like, no, I think it has to be much more integrated with with the community, identifying, there's lots of human wildlife conflict literature on this, really identifying what it is that's going on in a particular location, what it is that people have a grievance against, who is stoking those, viewpoints, if that's happening, right? What politics is going on. And for that, you really have to be embedded there, and you have to know what's happening, and you can't speak from 30,000, 60,000 feet.
Okay, thanks. That's all. I think that's all. In interest of time, perhaps we can move on to the question answer session. Riya, all yours. Thanks, Shermin.
Thanks, Meghna.
Thank you, Meghna ma'am. Thank you, Shermin ma'am. That was a really interesting conversation. Now we move on to the last part of our today's evening. It's a question answer session, which is headed by Shikhar. So Shikhar is a nature and a wildlife enthusiast with broad research interests, including ecology and conservation biology and natural resource management. He holds a master's degree in environmental management and bachelor's in zoology honors. Currently, he is a third-year Ph.D. student at the Department of Biology at Ashoka University. His research focuses on understanding various aspects of human-elephant conflict in Angul Forest Circle, Odisha. Additionally, his interests extend to understanding the behavioral ecology and acoustics of elephants, as well as social dimensions of conflict and coexistence. Shikhar, I give the stage to you to host the Q&A session.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Riya, and thank you, Sherman and Meghna, for the great talk and conversation. So I will start the quick Q&A session with a couple of questions that I have had, and meanwhile, I would request everyone to type their questions in the chat box, and I will convey it to Dr. Sherman. So, Dr. Sherman, one thing that I found very interesting was that you talked about how Asian elephants have evolved to have a grass dominant diet, although they are mixed feeders, but they have like a grass dominant diet. But at least in my study area, I've seen that those grass patches are few and far between. It's mostly like a woodland sort of an ecosystem, which is like sort of like on the edge or mosaic with all the agricultural land. So what does that entail if elephants are living in that sort of an ecosystem where they have to be like mixed browsers and have feed on grass only when the grass is available? So does what does that entail for the physiology of the elephants in the longer run? And does that also result in them doing more crop depredation because they want to like get hold of certain nutrients that they would not normally get with the browse that they're eating?
Possibly, because I can't remember where I read this or heard this, but like for grass and having good green grass, fresh grass can be important for milk production, for example. It can have, it can be important for being in good physiological health to reproduce and being in good body condition. So if that grass is not available, then of course they can survive on the browse and the dry, other things. And I don't know to what extent, they need to have a balance of those two things. Because again, they can do perfectly well. It's just that they may not be at such high densities, right? And so they may make, again, social structure kind of adjustments by not being in such large groups. They may be in smaller groups where there's less competition for those little patches of grass. And they may, they may have to increase how the distance that they walk around the range, right? Whereas, if there's much more rich grass or a richer source of food, they can be in both larger groups and be in a smaller area and cover less ground. So all of that has, consequences for like the energy expenditure and that can downstream affect things like birth intervals, how good the calf's, the condition is of the mother, calf survival. And if there is an opportunity then where you see a really concentrated, crop or something that's a good resource, that could motivate wanting to feed on that. Now, males and females though, females are more risk averse than males, and so we observe in India and Sri Lanka a lot of the time it's males that are involved in the crop foraging and less so the females, which is not to say the females don't do it at all, but it's less so the females. And if the studies from Africa by Patrick Chio, for example, make a convincing argument that this is part of this high risk, high gain strategy for males, where they want to bulk up and they want to become competitively, as quickly as possible. They want to get as big as possible. And that also is the case for Rambo. So Rambo was, sitting there bulking up and then he hit what we think is around his 40s. And then he started going after females. So he was sitting around the fence, even in his must, even during his must, and not really, like for the first 20 years, right, really not really moving from that fence. And then all of a sudden now he hits his reproductive peak and he's going around with females and he's going inside the park and he's also starting to raise sugarcane. So that life history stage change seems to be an important trigger. So for females, if there is forest and if there is cover and if there is still grass, they may not choose to risk it with their calves and with their young and to be out in the cropland. So it's not just the nutrition, but it's the amount of risk that you have to undertake to be able to benefit from that nutrition. So it's this classic, landscape of fear, predator versus resource kind of trade-off, predator security versus resource gain. we do see in Southeast Asia that we hear reports that females are crop raiding, and they are doing that. So, why that variation, I think, is an interesting question, and you would have to piece apart the different variables in each location to see, what is the quality of the available forage there versus what is the risk that people, sometimes people are at very low densities in Southeast Asia and Thailand, where like it's just very small villages, very small, number of people maybe compared to the croplands and large agricultural crops, right? Like palm oil or something, like, these huge plantations. Well, the risk there is very low, right? As opposed to in India and Sri Lanka, where you have very heavily defended small mosaic crop, smallholder, so where the risk is much higher if you're a female.
Also like a follow-up to this question, like you talked about how males being more involved in like crop depredation and like conflict in general. So like there are reports, at least from my study area, that when there are conflict-related incidents happen, so there is a skewness in the mortality of males versus females. So males or Makhnas get more involved in conflict, and the deaths happen like more of males and females. So what does that entail like for the overall population? Because there will be then skewness in like a gender or like a sex ratio that population has to maintain.
Yeah, I mean, if there is a biased mortality, then that of course can have a an impact on the gene pool. I mean, with elephants, generally, like overall, like males versus male biased mortality, that doesn't have as much of an effect because of the polygyny and everything like that. But in places where you have extreme sex ratio skew, that can be a problem. I'm not so worried about like tuskers versus non-tuskers. Like that's the tusks are nice, but you have to lose them, then you lose them. And Sri Lanka is mostly tuskless males, and they're like, in terms of like the population, that doesn't have much of an effect. I mean, although it's nice to have tuskers in the population. But if there's biased mortality, it's more of a concern when you have, like, for example, again, the Rambo case, or like males that are going and crop foraging. If there are certain personality types, like if there's differential mortality of certain character traits and personality types, there are these innovative, kind of individuals who are also pretty gentle and pretty, they're fed, and because they're very docile with people, and so people kind of like can walk up to them, and so that's a personality trait, and if those individuals are differentially being killed for whatever reason because they are taking risks that they shouldn't do things, that can have also a consequence that we might not appreciate as much as tusks versus tuskless. There are also some questions in the chat, Shikhar, that we might want to get to there. Yeah,
I will now get to the questions in the chat box. So this question is from Vadiraj Deshpande. So you talked about differences in molars depending on diet and grass respectively. Can you like talk a little bit about difference, if any, in the gastrointestinal tract of the elephants while they were evolving?
Oh, okay. That's a great question, and I have to say I actually don't know much about that, because for one thing, that kind of thing doesn't fossilize very well, so we don't know what their digestive system would have looked like. But just if I were just to speculate based on what we know today, I'm sure they had vastly different microbiomes, because the kinds of gut microflora that you would need to process one type of diet is probably very different than what you would need from the other. And then I don't know if there would have been differences in length of the gastrointestinal tract, for example. We do know that elephants are more like horses in that they have relatively simple guts, right? They don't do the fermentation process that cattle and things do. So I would speculate that there would be, but I actually don't know a whole lot about what the actual differences would have been.
Sure. There's another question by Seema. She asks, what is the specific loss of biodiversity due to diminishing number of elephants?
So loss of biodiversity due to loss of elephants, I think I wouldn't draw a direct causal arrow there, but it's more that, elephants themselves, like, yes, they are ecosystem engineers, so they are spreading seeds, they're doing all kinds of things that, are modifying these micro habitats and modifying habitats over various spatial scales. But also, like, environments that support elephants also support other species, and so they kind of represent different kinds of ecosystems. So in our study, what we call elephant ecosystems, that's a broad array of everything from these forested environments to including Southeast Asia, to the more drier woodland type of environments. And so losing elephants themselves, for example, through hunting, while that environment is still there, well, the other species, they might still be intact. So like if you just remove elephants over a long period of time, you might see change because elephants are not dispersing certain seeds, and so they're not propagating certain grasses or trees or what have you. But in the immediate term, that's not a consequence. But if you are losing elephants because the habitat is just disappearing, right? And so that's it. So if elephants are serving as a sort of indicator for whether that habitat is there or not, well, then of course you're losing all the other species that live in that habitat too. So.
Another question by Parasmita is that do you have any opinions regarding the religious belief that persists in India regarding elephants, and if it's encouragingly positive or negative with respect to the human-elephant interactions?
So that's a very interesting question, and some people have looked at this in southern India. Takekura's paper, for example, looking at different kind of cultural views towards elephants, and it hasn't been studied as much. But we've also looked at it in Sri Lanka a little bit, where we have this Buddhist outlook, and so we have Hinduism and Buddhism that have relationships with elephants in various ways. And it's interesting in that I think people kind of tend to, especially in the West, tend to maybe oversimplify that. There's this perspective, there's this sense that people view elephants as sacred, because of their associations with religion. And what we see, at least in Sri Lanka, is that not that people view elephants as such as sacred. They might view temple elephants as being sacred, or they might think that elephants are important for their culture, like for the processions, for the this, for the that. But they don't necessarily think wild elephants are sacred. And so that's an oversimplification of how people view elephants. And I think above everything else, like if you have that sort of like symbolic value of elephants versus the very real risk that they present to lifestyle, livelihood, safety and well-being, of course people prioritize that. And so it's very conceivable that even though they might have a sort of general, like value of elephants, whether it's in the spiritual domain or there's some other way, and that sort of like sets a predisposition to have like to be more tolerant, to have a more positive perspective. If their immediate lives and livelihoods are impacted and cause stress, worry, harm, anxiety, economic loss, then that can very easily change. And we see even that in Bhutan, for example, where Bhutan is kind of very renowned for its sort of past Pacific its culture of very friendly, nice people, and also having a lot of forest cover and being very environmentally sound, but when you see areas with conflict, people's opinions change very quickly, and as conflict intensifies, people's opinions change dramatically very quickly. And so I don't think that necessarily can just be counted on as a thing to get us out of trouble.
On a similar note, there is another question by Divya. In India and Sri Lanka, unfortunately, house a lot of elephants in the temples. We also have a lot of rescued elephants. So how would you best recommend rescued elephants be treated? Ideally, should they be introduced back in the wild, or they be like kept in the rescue centers or something like that? Yeah.
Yeah, so this is outside of my immediate experience, so I can't speak to it without knowing specifics of those rescue elephants. But to make a general statement, I think would be risky because they might come from all kinds of backgrounds. Depending on how long they were in captivity, with how they were treated, But in general, elephants have spent a long time in human care, or like maybe came into it as babies, right? They probably wouldn't really have the skills that they need to be able to be released into the wild. They need to know how to, forage. They need to know what to eat, where to go, and all the things that we would have to learn as a human. If you were to drop a person into a forest and say, okay, go survive, that wouldn't work. So the rescued elephants that are rehabilitated, however, in these rescue centers, there are several. There's one in Sri Lanka. There are a couple in India where you have juveniles that are rescued specifically with the intention of releasing them into the wild, and they're given the training and they're given what they need to know to survive. Those ideally, the younger they are that you get them and that you can rehabilitate them and send them back, I think yes, they should be sent back. But when you get adults and they're older and they can't really fend for themselves, certainly then they need to be in more of a sanctuary situation.
Meghna also has a question. So Malhi has a paper where he says disturbance due to mega herbivores, which have declined a lot since the Holocene, was replaced by disturbance due to fires. Perhaps elephants were the disturbance creating savannas in areas before humans started burning forests. So, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, very interesting proposition. So, and I mean, again, like I don't have the paleontological knowledge to say, one way or the other what I think about that hypothesis. I think it's a really interesting hypothesis, and I think it's perfectly plausible, given that maybe these mega. So one thing about the dispersal, I will say, is that remember that time frame of humans versus chimpanzees, the divergence. It's like about 6 million years, 5 to 7 million years. And proboscideans made it out of Africa 20 million years ago. So that's long before humans were humans, right? So elephants were on these landscapes. They were doing their thing long before people were modifying the landscapes in any kind of substantial way. So they had to have a major influence on the landscape. And then later on, come fire, well, that has to do with also climate change, right? Were there environments that were getting more dry and getting to be more grass dominated as a result of climate change that would have enabled fires to take place and be even naturally set lightning fires to be more of a thing than say more heavily forested environments. Again, that would have all been going on, I would probably say, prior to the arrival of humans. And so the role of fire, I think now becomes interesting as we get closer to the present, right? Like how much of that fire dynamic would have been anthropogenically driven and would have really just been maintaining something that previously was going on. Yeah, I think it's an interesting question that still needs a lot of exploration.
One last question from Avijan is that can Maljurians, that is a male herd, are they navigating herds into new foraging landscapes?
I'm sorry, I missed it. What are the herds navigating to?
If I'm not wrong, and correct me if I'm wrong, this question, I guess, is about are male herds navigating like mixed herds or female herds into new foraging landscapes?
I see. So male groups. So we don't know how long-lived those male groups are. So there are those studies from southern India, Srinivasan and other people that Srivastava, sorry, that males are associating in these male groups in these more anthropogenically modified landscapes, and we see that also in Sri Lanka. Whether they actually stick together for a long period of time, that we don't know, and whether they're kind of moving together into new landscapes, that also we don't know. I would just anecdotally from these observations in China, right, with this elephant group that was going over this huge distance during COVID, there were bulls in that group. There were males in that group, which was kind of surprising, right? You have the females and males, this mixed group kind of choosing to go this long distance together. So I think there's still a lot to be learned about male sociality, and that is, a lot of what we know is based on females, but males may be doing different things in different environments, and we just don't know.
So that was all of the questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Dr. Sherman. Thank you, Shikhar, for hosting a wonderful Q&A session. So
Thank you.
I thank all the speakers for this intellectual evening and opening up on the world of elephants. Thank you for helping us understand on their roles on ecosystem and humans and how we should coexist together to have a better and a bright future. I also thank all the participants for listening to us, and I hope that your curiosity to dive deep into the world of elephants have increased. And I hope that we all contribute even minuscule towards the conservation of ecosystem moving forward. Thank you everyone for this wonderful session and joining us.
Thank you. And I want to thank everybody who joined so late in the evening for you. I really appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Sherman. Thanks, everybody.
All right. Take care.
Thank you, everyone.
Good.